An iron will is the only thing that stands between a man and the crushing weight of a cold, indifferent destiny. Watch as we bring you the most inspiring tales of perseverance and the final victory of the spirit. Subscribe today and fuel your own fire with us. She knew exactly what she was doing, and my son had no idea. My name is Richard Calloway. I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years building a commercial real estate portfolio that my father started with a single warehouse in Cincinnati. Today, that portfolio is worth somewhere north of $90 million. I don't say that to impress anyone. I say it because it matters to what happened at my son's anniversary dinner last October. It matters because a woman named Vivian Cross had done her homework long before she ever shook my hand. My son Daniel met Vivian at a charity gala in Chicago 18 months before any of this. He was 41, recently divorced, the kind of man who threw himself into work after heartbreak and came out the other side, a little lonelier than he let on. Vivian was 38, sharp-dressed, articulate. She told him she worked in philanthropic development connecting high-net-worth donors with nonprofit organizations across the Midwest. Daniel called me 2 weeks after meeting her and said, "Dad, I think she might be the one." I hadn't heard him say anything like that in years. I told him I was glad. I met Vivian for the first time at a dinner Daniel hosted at his home in Lincoln Park. She brought wine, remembered the name of Daniel's ex-wife, only to express quiet sympathy, and spent 20 minutes asking me about the early days of Calloway Properties. Not the success, the struggle. The warehouse fires, the zoning disputes, the bank that turned us down 4 times before finally saying yes. She asked the right questions. She laughed at the right moments. By the end of the night, I thought Daniel had found someone remarkable. For 14 months, I had no reason to think otherwise. She was present at every family gathering. Thanksgiving in Cincinnati, Christmas at my sister's place in Louisville. She sent my wife, Margaret, flowers on her birthday without being asked. She learned that my grandson, Tyler Daniel's boy from his first marriage, liked model trains, and she found him a limited edition Pennsylvania Railroad locomotive that he still keeps on his shelf. She was, by every visible measure, exactly what she appeared to be. The anniversary dinner was Daniel's idea. 1 year together. He rented out the private dining room at 16, the restaurant in the Trump Tower overlooking the Chicago River. 14 guests. Close family. A few of Daniel's oldest friends. He had been hinting for weeks that he planned to propose that evening. I knew it. Margaret knew it. I think most of the table knew it. There was a ring. I had seen the box in his jacket pocket when he hugged me at the door. I was standing near the window with a glass of scotch, watching the river lights when Tyler came to stand beside me. He was 15, quiet the way his father was quiet, with the same habit of looking at his shoes when something was bothering him. He looked at his shoes for a long moment. Then he looked up at me and said, very low, Grandpa, "I need to tell you something about Vivienne." Something I heard. I kept my face still. I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Tell me." He had been staying at Daniel's apartment 2 weekends earlier. He woke up past midnight for a glass of water and heard Vivian on the phone in the kitchen, speaking quietly. He stood in the hallway and listened. He said nos, to the talking to someone. A man, and the words that stopped him were these: "The proposal is happening in October. Once we're engaged, I move on the estate documentation. Marcus, just make sure your end is clean." Tyler stood there a moment longer, then went back to his room. He didn't sleep. He spent 2 weeks deciding whether to say anything, turning it over, telling himself maybe he'd misheard. Maybe it was something innocent. But the word estate kept coming back to him. He knew what I was worth in a general way, the way kids of wealthy families always know without being told directly. And he knew that his father was planning to propose. I squeezed his shoulder once and told him he had done exactly the right thing by telling me. I told him to go enjoy the dinner, eat something, and act completely normal. I told him I would handle it. What I did not tell him was that my stomach had dropped straight through the floor. I excused myself to use the restroom and stood at the sink for 2 full minutes. The water ran cold over my wrists. I looked at myself in the mirror and did what I have trained myself to do in 32 years of high-stakes negotiations. I organized the information. I separated what I knew from what I suspected. I made a list in my head of what I needed to find out before Daniel got down on one knee in front of 14 people and locked this woman into our lives permanently. What I knew. Vivienne had been on the phone late at night, in secret, speaking to a man named Marcus about a proposal, an estate, and documentation. What I suspected, she was not who she said she was. What I needed, evidence, not suspicion. Because Daniel loved this woman, and if I walked out of that restroom and accused her based on a 15-year-old's overheard phone call, I would lose my son. I walked back out with a smile on my face and asked the waiter for another scotch. The dinner lasted 3.5 hours. Daniel proposed over dessert. Vivienne cried. The table applauded. I watched her face when she said yes. Watched it the way you watch a business partner sign a contract you're not entirely sure about. And I saw something flicker behind her eyes for just a fraction of a second. Not joy. Calculation. Gone before anyone else could have caught it. But I caught it. I hugged Daniel. I shook Vivienne's hand and said I was delighted. I meant neither. That night, driving home on I-90, I called my attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who had handled Callaway Properties' legal affairs for 19 years. I told him I needed a private investigator, the best one he knew, and I needed absolute discretion. Gerald asked no questions. He texted me a name before I reached my exit. Her name was Carol Brandt, former federal investigator, 12 years in financial crimes, now running a boutique firm in downtown Chicago. I met her at her office at 7 the next morning and told her everything Tyler had said, word for word. I told her Vivienne Cross claimed to work in philanthropic development, that she had never given me the name of a specific organization, that the man on the phone was named Marcus. I gave Carol a photograph from Daniel's Instagram and told her I needed a full background workup, and I needed it fast, because Daniel was the type of man who moved quickly once he decided something. Carol looked at the photograph for a moment and said, I'll start today. I went to the office and tried to work. I stared at acquisition reports I couldn't read. I ate lunch I couldn't taste. I called Margaret and told her only that I had concerns about Vivienne and that she should say nothing to Daniel until I knew more. Margaret, who had been married to me for 38 years, said, How bad is it? I said I didn't know yet. She said, Find out fast. Carol called me 4 days later and asked me to come in. She had a folder on the desk when I sat down. She did not open it immediately. She looked at me the way people look at you when they're about to tell you something that will change the shape of your day, and she said, Richard, the woman your son is engaged to is not named Vivienne Cross. I said nothing. I waited. Her legal name, Carol told me, was Sandra Paulette Mercer, born in Dayton, Ohio, 41 years ago. No college degree, despite the prestigious Northwestern credential on her LinkedIn profile. No employment history in philanthropic development. 2 prior marriages, one annulled in Nevada. One ended in a divorce settlement that her former husband, a property developer in Phoenix named Howard Ellerman, had spent 4 years trying to recover from in court. Howard Ellerman had accused his ex-wife of forging his signature on documents that redirected a significant portion of his business assets into an account she controlled. The case settled. The terms were sealed. Howard Ellerman had since relocated to Portugal. Marcus was her brother. Marcus Mercer, 44, a notary public operating out of a small office in Indianapolis. He had twice been investigated for document fraud, once in 2017, once in 2021. Neither investigation had resulted in charges. Both had involved falsified estate documentation. I sat with that for a moment. Carol opened the folder and slid a printed page across the desk. It was a screenshot of a website for an organization called the Midwestern Children's Foundation, based in Naperville. Vivienne Sandra had told Daniel she was their director of philanthropic partnerships. The organization was real. I called them myself from Carol's office, asked to be connected to Vivienne Cross in philanthropic partnerships. The woman who answered said, I'm sorry, we don't have anyone by that name here. I asked how large their partnerships team was. She said 3 people. I knew all 3 names within the hour. Sandra Mercer was not among them. I sat in Carol's office for a while after that, not panicking, organizing. The picture was clear enough. Sandra had identified Daniel as a target wealthy, recently divorced, emotionally available. She had played the long game, 14 months of consistent, patient, believable performance. She had built trust with the family, established credibility, inserted herself into the texture of our lives. The goal was the engagement, then the marriage, then access to the estate. Her brother Marcus, with his notary stamp and his history with document fraud, was the mechanism. Once she was Mrs. Daniel Calloway, legally entitled to make certain representations, Marcus would provide whatever paperwork was needed to execute the transfer. It was not amateur work. It was a practiced operation with a clear prior template in Howard Ellerman. She had done this before. She would do it again. I thanked Carol, paid her invoice in full, and drove to Gerald Foss's office. Gerald and I spent 90 minutes going over everything. I needed to know exactly what exposure Daniel had, what protections were already in place, and where the vulnerabilities were. The Calloway family trust was well structured. Gerald had made sure of that. But Gerald confirmed what I had already feared. Once a spouse is legally married into a family with access to shared financial instruments and the right notary can produce the right documentation, the cleanup becomes extraordinarily expensive and complicated. The goal was not to begin the cleanup. The goal was to prevent the marriage from happening. But here was the problem. Daniel was in love, and I had watched him rebuild himself after his first divorce with tremendous difficulty, and I knew that if I walked up to him with a folder full of documents and told him the woman he was about to marry had used a false name and was planning to rob us, his first instinct would not be gratitude. It would be disbelief. Then defensiveness. Then possibly a rupture between us that would give Sandra exactly the isolation from family support she needed to complete her plan. I had to let him see it himself. I called Tyler and told him I needed one more thing from him. I asked him to tell his father casually in the next few days that he had heard Vivian mention the name Marcus and ask who Marcus was. Just that. Nothing more. Plant the question. See what Vivian said when Daniel asked her. Tyler is 15, but he is not a child in the ways that matter. He said, "Okay, Grandpa, I can do that." 3 days later, Daniel called me at 9 in the evening, and I could hear something different in his voice before he said a single word. He said, "Dad." Tyler asked Vivienne about someone named Marcus. She said she didn't know anyone named Marcus. Then she went quiet for about 20 minutes and said she had a headache and went to bed. He paused. "I've been sitting here trying to figure out why that bothers me." Another pause. "Does it bother you?" I said, "Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" "Bring nothing. Tell Vivian you have an early meeting." He came at 8. I had the folder on my desk. I walked him through everything without editorializing. I showed him Sandra Mercer's real name, her real history, the prior marriage in Phoenix, the document fraud investigations, the Marcus connection, the phone call Tyler had overheard. I read him the exact words. "The proposal is happening in October. Once we're engaged, I move on the estate documentation. Marcus, just make sure your end is clean." Daniel did not speak for a long time. He looked at the documents with the careful, methodical attention he had inherited from me, and I had inherited from my father. He went through each page twice. When he finally looked up, his eyes were dry, but there was a quality to his stillness that I recognized, because I had seen it in the mirror the night of the anniversary dinner. He was organizing the information, separating what he knew from what he felt. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, 10 days. He nodded slowly. He said, "Tyler?" I said, "Tyler came to me first. He didn't know what to do with it. He was trying to protect you." Daniel looked out the window for a moment. Then he said, "What do we do?" I told him what Gerald Foss and I had discussed. We were not going to confront her with accusations that could be disputed or lawyered away. We were going to give her an opportunity to produce her own evidence. Daniel would go home, tell Vivian that his father's estate attorney needed updated beneficiary documentation for insurance purposes, and ask her if she could provide her full legal name and a government-issued ID for the file. A routine request. The kind a real future daughter-in-law would handle without hesitation. If Sandra Mercer produced an ID in the name Vivian Cross, we had her on document fraud immediately. If she produced her real ID, she had just confirmed to Daniel, with her own hand, that she had been operating under a false identity for 14 months. Either way, the conversation that followed would happen on our terms, with evidence already in hand, and with Gerald Foss on standby. Daniel went home that afternoon. I sat in my office and waited. He called me at 6:47 p.m. His voice was very steady. He said, "She left." I said, "What?" He said when he made the request, framed it exactly as we'd discussed. Routine documentation, estate attorney, just needs your legal name, and ID. Vivienne had gone still. She said of course. She'd find her passport. She went into the bedroom. He heard the closet. He heard what sounded like a bag. He waited in the kitchen for 8 minutes, and when he walked to the bedroom door and opened it, she was gone. Bedroom window faced the alley. She had taken a single bag, her laptop, and the jewelry he had given her. She had left the engagement ring on the nightstand. Daniel called me after standing in the bedroom for a while. I told him to call Gerald immediately and to not touch anything else until Gerald arrived. Gerald filed the police report that evening: identity fraud, attempted financial fraud, conspiracy. We provided Carol Brandt's full investigative file. The detective assigned to the case told us that the material was substantial and that Sandra Mercer was a known subject in an ongoing investigation out of Indianapolis that they had been unable to close due to lack of a complaining witness willing to go on record. We were, he said, the first. The Indianapolis investigation was reopened within 2 weeks. Marcus Mercer was brought in for questioning. Gerald tells me the case is moving through the system. I don't have a verdict to give you yet, but I can tell you that the last known address they had for Sandra Mercer was a short-term rental in Indianapolis, and that the rental had been vacated. She is somewhere. People like her are always somewhere, running the same play on someone new. What I want to tell you, the thing I have been thinking about since Daniel and I sat across from each other in my office and he looked at those documents with that steady, careful, heartbroken expression, is that I almost didn't say anything. There is a version of this story where I talk myself out of it, where I decide I misread Vivienne's expression at the anniversary dinner, where I tell myself Tyler is a 15-year-old who heard fragments of a phone call in the dark and filled in the gaps with a teenager's imagination, where I respect my adult son's autonomy and his right to choose his own partner, and I stay in my lane, and I say nothing. I almost chose that version. I want to be honest about that. But I kept thinking about Howard Ellerman in Portugal, rebuilding from something that had already happened, something that could have been stopped if someone had asked a single question earlier. I kept thinking about Tyler standing in that hallway at midnight, knowing something was wrong, spending 2 weeks deciding whether the people who were supposed to protect him could actually be trusted with what he knew. He decided they could. He came to me. A 15-year-old kid bet on his grandfather, and I was not going to lose that bet. So I did not stay in my lane. I will tell you what I told Daniel the morning after she left, when he came back to my office and we sat with coffee, and neither of us said much for a while. I told him that what she had done to him was not a reflection of his judgment or his worth or his capacity to be loved honestly. I told him that practiced deception at this level is not something most people are equipped to recognize because most people are not, at their core, operating with that kind of malice. Daniel is a good man. He trusted a person who had spent years perfecting the performance of being trustworthy. That is not naivety. That is what it looks like to live without armor. He asked me how long it would take to feel normal again. I told him I didn't know. I told him that Tyler was going to need him present and steady more than ever right now, because Tyler had carried that secret alone for 2 weeks, and that kind of weight leaves a mark on a kid. Daniel nodded at that. I watched something shift in him, the grief stepping slightly to the side to make room for the father. He said, "I'll talk to him tonight." I said, "Good." We sat there a little longer. The coffee went cold. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do, indifferent and continuous, and I thought about my father, and the single warehouse in Cincinnati, and the 32 years it had taken to build something worth protecting. I thought about how protection is never finished, how you don't build a wall and walk away. You pay attention. You stay close to the people who trust you with what they know. You make yourself available to the 15-year-old standing in the dark hallway who isn't sure if what he heard means anything, and who decides, finally, to walk to his grandfather's side and say the words out loud. That is the whole of it, really. Everything else is paperwork. My son is going to be fine. He has Tyler, who is braver than he knows. He has Margaret and me, and Gerald Foss, and a case number in Indianapolis that is moving in the right direction. And the next time someone asks to be added to the Callaway estate documentation, Gerald Foss will handle it personally, on day 1, before the second date.